This is a mini lesson on physical evidence to cover the different types of physical evidence we're going to explore in the class this year. Locard's exchange principle states that with contact between two items, there will be an exchange. And this value of this contact forensic evidence was first recognized by Edmund Locard in 1910. He was the director of the very first crime lab that was located in Lyon, France. And the idea is whenever a criminal comes in contact with things at a crime scene, the contact between those two items will leave a trace. And this will provide a lot of information that can help you solve a crime. So, one of the first examples of evidence we're going to look at is paint. You can do physical and chemical analyses of paint evidence, and that paint can be chips, residues, and when you look at it, you can indicate what its class is. So, is it automobile paint, house paint, nail polish, etc.? And when you're doing this, you can look at a database that has 40,000 different types of paint classified, and it's used to identify a particular make, model of a car, or maybe a brand of a tool. You can also indicate the individual characteristics of paint evidence. So, if an investigator is able to find similarities between two samples, such as the color, the number of layers, chemical composition, or maybe a physical match between two edges of where the paint has chipped off, or maybe from a tool from one crime scene to the suspect, that will provide a link between those two, between the suspect and the crime scene. And most of the paint evidence that is analyzed comes from hit and run cases whenever a driver hits another car or a person and then leaves the crime scene. Glass is another piece of physical evidence that can be investigated. And you can find glass at various crime scenes. So if they break a window to enter a house, a hit and run car accident, vandalism, and even murder will have glass particles at these types of crime scenes. And you can analyze it for its color. Glass will have certain surface characteristics. Some might have a tint. They'll have different thicknesses, different densities, and chemical composition, as well as refractive index, known as RI, which is how the light refracts off of the glass. The results of these tests will provide clues about the crime, and it helps investigators connect evidence to a suspect or another object that might have been used in the crime. So, for example, matching the glass from a crime scene to a headlight on the suspect's car. And down here, you can see this is looking at glass under a microscope, so it's magnified and you start to see the details on the glass. Also, patterns in whenever the glass is cracked or break can reveal a lot of information about speed, position, or maybe angle of impact. Whenever you're exploring explosives, the substances can help you determine the explosive substance chemical composition. Will be able to identify the type of explosive used or where it came from, known as its origin. And traces of explosives can be found on suspects' clothing, skin, hair, or other objects, and that will match the explosives from the crime scene to a suspect. Also, the materials used to make an explosive device will be compared to evidence found in the suspect's possession, and that's another link between the suspect and the crime. Ballistic is referring to ammunition and firearms, and the characteristics that you find matches between suspects and evidence found at a crime scene can be very powerful. You can use chemical tests, and that will show gunshot residue, known as GSR, on the hands, face, or clothing of a victim or suspect. And it's going to provide information about how close a person was to a fired gun. Rifling are the grooves in a gun barrel that causes distinct grooves, scratches, or dents on fired bullets, and it can match the weapon to the ammunition. Police are able to search an integrated ballistics identification system, IBIS. This is a database that compares markings from bullets, cartridge casings, and shells to ballistic evidence. And you can see some example of these marks on a bullet. And you're going to need to use usually a microscope to look at this stuff. When you hear the word caliber or gauge, what that refers to is the size of the diameter of a gun's barrel. And guns are classified by caliber or gauge. Dust and dirt, leaves, and sand can tell you where a person has been, where they might have picked up the stuff at a crime scene, or maybe they left it behind. And investigators can examine for chemical composition, pollen, plant material, or other organic matter that will link suspects to a specific crime scene. Fingerprints are very powerful, and there's three types of fingerprint patterns that investigators look for: it's arches, loops, and whorls. They'll also identify unique ridge characteristics that a fingerprint will link to a specific suspect or victim. The database that has all this is the AFIS, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, and investigators at all levels can search this database to find unknown fingerprints they might have found at a crime scene to see if they can link it with a person in the database. There's several types of impression evidence that can be collected at a crime scene. Shoe prints and tire tracks, you can collect it by taking a photograph. You can lift it up with tape, or you can use plaster and make a cast of it, and then compare it to suspect shoes or tires. You can also examine the evidence to identify a particular brand of shoe or tire based on the patterns and other physical features. And shoes and tires will also show different types of wear patterns and based on the use, and different features, maybe scratches and nicks and cuts that can match evidence to specific items. So for example, if you look at your shoes, you tend to have a natural wear pattern based on your walking style. And if you left your shoe print behind, that might be able to link the footprint specifically to you. Bite marks also are very unique. Each of your 32 teeth will have a unique design due to age and wear. And detectives can take impressions and photographs to compare bite marks that might be left on a victim or assailant or some other object and match it with dental records. Tool marks also will leave impressions. So maybe tiny nicks and chips on the edge of the tool will leave a unique impression that will identify a match between evidence and suspects. And tools can also pick up other substances or blood that can be tested and even lift fingerprints off of them to link it to a suspect. Whenever objects are broken, you get these fracture patterns, or fracture lines where you get two unique edges that are formed where the object that was once one object is broken into multiple objects. And these edges can be compared with either the naked eye or microscopes to see if they fit together, which will allow you to see if maybe this was all one object at a time, and then now you have pieces of it. So investigators can compare the edges of different things like pieces of tape, glass fragments, paste chips, parts of a car that were in an accident, paper bag, and find matches. So that will link two separate objects together as one, providing a link. Wounds can give you information about the weapons or tools that created the wound. And you can also maybe determine like the size of the weapon, the shape, and the length. And analyzing the wound can provide clues about the victim's injury, characteristics of the suspect, whether they're right, left handed, short, or tall, and how the suspect and the victim were positioned relative to each other at the time of the crime. Question documents will be any document that can be provide clues or links to a crime or a specific suspect. You can do that with the type of paper used, the printing method, some handwriting style or type of ink, and then other unique features such as watermark, a particular type of stationery, and when you write on papers, you'll leave indentations. All this can provide useful clues for investigators. Insects can provide information about a corpse, such flies, beetles, and other insects. And the scientists that study this are known as forensic entomologists. So they'll use factors such as weather conditions, where the body was found, what kind of condition it was in, and then compare that with their knowledge of the life cycle of the insects to help them estimate what's known as the post-mortem interval, or PMI. And this is the time between death and when the body was discovered. DNA is a very powerful piece of evidence, and it can be extracted from just about any tissue. So, for example, hair, fingernails, bones, teeth, and body fluids. And it's used to create a profile, and you can compare that profile from the suspects or victims in the crime. The database that has all the DNA samples is known as CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, and it's maintained by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And it can be used to match unknown DNA samples from a crime scene to people that are listed in this database. Skeletal remains have a lot of information. So this is going to be um, victims that are found very far past the time of the crime, and you kind of lost a lot of the tissue and you got the skeletal remains. You're going to need a forensic anthropologist to analyze these skeletal remains, and they can figure out four characteristics of a victim from the skeletal remains. They can determine the age of the victim's sex, race, and then their stature, basically how tall they are and how they're built, whether they're a thin or heavy build. Sex is determined by the pelvis and also the humerus and the femur. Age and stature can be determined by the teeth, so how well developed the teeth are, bone growth, and length of specific bones, such as the femur. Race is determined by characteristics of the skull that are common among people of different races. And like I said before, you can also collect DNA samples from the bones, teeth, and hair, but also previous injuries will still be present and be observed in your skeletal remains. So you can link a person based on past injuries, recent injuries, bone fractures, and just other signs of trauma might give more information about the crime and what happened to the victim. So, in general, forensic anthropologists will go to a crime scene and they assist in the collection of the human remains that have been found. They'll then take it back to the lab where they'll clean up the bones so that they can get a closer look at them. And they're going to start looking at the bones closely and establishing a profile of the individual. They'll look for any trauma that might be evident on the bones to maybe establish what the cause of death was. So, if it was a bullet or maybe a stab wound, they're going to work with a forensic odontologist, known as a dentist, to look and match dental records to try to identify the victim. And then they will testify in court about the identity of the individual or the injuries that might be evident on the skeleton. They are not the ones that conduct autopsies. They do not analyze blood splatter. They do not analyze ballistics or weapon evidence, run DNA tests, or collect trace evidence such as hair and fiber. That's someone else's job. So, body fluids could be blood, semen, saliva, sweat, urine. This is all considered body fluids. And if you analyze them, you can get information about the crime as well as the victim or suspect. These body fluids will be analyzed with chemicals and also UV light. UV stands for ultraviolet. So you can use this at a crime scene to find body fluid evidence that might not be evident to the naked eye. And any areas that might have potential body fluid evidence will be swabbed, bagged, and collected in vials. And they keep those airtight so you don't have contamination, and they can take that back to the lab and see what kind of evidence they can get. So, examples of type of evidence you can pick up from body fluids: vomit and urine. You can test for alcohol, drugs, and poisons. Cigarette butts may contain dried saliva, which will you can get DNA evidence from. Semen also contains valuable DNA evidence, and blood you can get DNA, but also the splatter of blood can provide clues about what happened at the crime scene. The final type of evidence, hairs and fibers. There's always going to be transfer of hair and fibers between a suspect and maybe the victim if they come in contact with each other. So, a suspect may pick up carpet fibers on his shoes or leave hairs behind at a crime scene, and you can examine these hairs and identify the origin, such as human or animal. And if the root is on the end of the hair, you can test that root for DNA. And then fibers from things such as clothing, carpet, furniture, beds, and blankets can be compared to link a suspect or victim with a crime scene. And there's natural fibers from plants and animals, but there's also synthetic fibers that are man made, such as spandex, that more of a plastic. And all of these will provide specific connections between a crime scene and a suspect.